Less than a minute before the meeting was to begin, Mark Reynolds nonchalantly entered the room. He quietly took a seat against the back wall and turned his attention to the attractive woman standing in front of him. He couldn't help but notice her disdain as she glanced back at him before checking her watch and calling the meeting to order. The woman was tall with a rather prominent nose, but it suited her face very well. His grandmother called such people big-boned. She was not overweight, but she had prominent shapes where Mark thought a woman should have them. Mark studied the woman as she turned to point to a slide presentation on a large monitor. In his opinion, she was in her mid-20s. Her dark hair slicked back into a tight bundle. Mark decided it was an attempt to appear stern and businesslike. Sandra Phillips, for her part, quickly determined that the last man who entered the conference room was what she considered a himbo, from the words him and bimbo, sexually attractive, sexually horny, naive, and stupid. He is about 6 feet tall, with a strong jaw and deep blue eyes. He is dressed in a business casual style that emphasizes his strong physique. At 9 a.m. sharp, Sandra started the meeting. I am now the marketing director and sales manager for Smith & Haynes. My name is Sandra Phillips. I have degrees in marketing and business administration. I hope that we can work together to increase sales as well as customer satisfaction. It is no secret that success in the marketplace comes from knowing a quality product sold at a competitive price. To that end, starting now, every member of our sales team will need to dress professionally. I see most of you have already accepted this fact. Mark couldn't help but notice that his new boss was looking right at him. Apparently, she didn't approve of his jacket and polo shirt. Men, when representing our company, you are required to wear a jacket and tie, or you will not work at Smith & Haynes. Ladies must also be dressed in appropriate business attire. There will be no exceptions. I'm not going to mention this today as it is obviously a new concept to some, but from now on, no one will be allowed to attend the weekly sales meeting in casual attire. Again, I'm telling you there will be no exceptions. Any questions? Mark couldn't hide a smirk as the woman looked at him with obvious irritation. Please state your name so I can make some notes in your file, she insisted, as Mark realized she was clearly trying to intimidate him. I don't think that's necessary, Mark replied, grinning wider and wider. Let's just get this meeting over with and get to work. Everyone in the room fell completely silent. Mark never took things too seriously, but now he was taking things too far with his new boss. You don't think this is necessary? Repeated the woman. You know what? I don't think your presence here is necessary. I've read the company policy. I have the authority to give you a week's leave without pay, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. You are not to appear in this building until next Monday's meeting. At that time, I will expect you to wear a jacket and tie and be prepared to apologize. Thank you, Miss Phillips, Mark said politely as he left the room. A week later, Mark walked into the meeting room wearing cargo shorts and an Eagles t-shirt. You do realize I'm not going to let you join our meeting dressed like that? Sandra Phillips said. You're acting like you want to get fired. I saved you the trouble, Mark replied, handing her a sealed envelope. This is my letter of resignation. I already went to HR and filled out the paperwork. Good luck with the company. The surprised woman tried to regain her composure. After their first meeting, she'd made some inquiries about Mark Reynolds. He's the best salesman in the company. His sales numbers are impressive. She believed that if she could just get him to dress appropriately and accept her mentoring, he would be even more successful. Now he's gone. 2 weeks later, Mark was lying on a dolly under an 80-year-old Alfa Romeo. He was trying to tighten the transmission when he heard a woman's cough trying to get his attention. With his feet, he carefully rolled the cart out from under the classic car into the open space and was more than surprised to see Mrs. Edna Haynes, the owner of the company he had so recently left. She had always treated him very fairly, and he had reciprocated. To see her in his workshop was a complete surprise. Mrs. Haynes, it's good to see you again. Is there a problem? I don't think I've ever seen you here before. There's just never been a reason to visit before, Mark. I know you're busy, so I'll get right to the point. You've been in contact with my new marketing director twice this week. Mark noticed that when she used the term marketing director, she put air quotes with her fingers. During the first meeting, she put you on a week's vacation without pay. During the second meeting, a week later, you handed her a letter of resignation. It occurred to me that the two of you didn't get along too well. Mrs. Haynes, when I started working for you many years ago, I said I wasn't going to cling to your company at all costs. This young lady showed up out of the blue, said my choice of clothing was inappropriate, and suspended me for a week. It made me realize that my time at Smith & Haynes was up. She and I will never look at things the same way. She's the boss, and my decision wasn't a hard one. It was easier for you than it was for us, Mrs. Haynes stated. We're already having trouble keeping your customers. More than a few of them have told me that they can get the same product for less money elsewhere. It is because of your dedication to the terms of the contract that many of our buyers have stayed with us. 2 days ago, I heard a story about how you drove 250 miles with a box of specialty bolts when you got a panicked call from one of your customers. They had been forgotten to order them along with other items we were supplying. You traveled a long way to make sure the customer was satisfied. It's just part of my job, I guess, Mark replied. It's nice that my gesture is appreciated, but it doesn't explain why you're standing here today. I don't work for you anymore. That's exactly the problem I want to solve. I'm willing to increase your commission as well as your base salary if you agree to return to Haynes & Smith, the older woman offered. Ma'am, I left your company for 2 different but very good reasons, Mark explained. The first is that my own business is growing. It's my future, and I'm working damn hard to make it a success. The second, more obvious reason is that your new marketing director has a grudge against me. I just don't want to waste my time listening to her ramble on about how to be a better salesperson. She has 2 college degrees and no real-world experience. I honestly don't know how she managed to get the job. Mark heard a sigh from the doorway. Turning around, he saw Sandra Phillips standing nearby. To his embarrassment, she was listening to his every word. He quickly tried to soften the harshness of his words. I'm sure Miss Phillips is highly qualified and will do a fine job for you. I'm just too stubborn and set in my ways to learn new methods. She deserves to be surrounded by the best people who will take her suggestions, follow her edicts, and work to expand the company. You've demonstrated, and why you're so good at sales, Mark. It was a very good way out of the crisis, Mrs. Haynes acknowledged with a smile. I thought you might refuse my offer, so I have a backup. If you agree to work with Sandy for 1 month and be her mentor, I'm willing to compensate you for a lot more than you bring home, and that's a lot. You should know that Sandy is my granddaughter, and she is the future of the company. In trying to establish herself, she went a little overboard, but now she has a clearer vision of our mission. I'm sure she'll do well, but I don't think she'll be very receptive to my suggestions and business methods. She has 2 college degrees, and I'm lucky to have at least graduated from high school. Mark, don't try to play me for a hunchback. I'm the one who hired you. As I recall, you were 5th in your class and pretty popular. Played on 2 sports teams, was in debate club, and was student council president your senior year, Mrs. Haynes said. You said you have a 7-year plan to build your automobile business and will probably leave Smith & Haynes at that time. There are 3 months left in the 7-year term, and I am only asking for 1 of those months. I believe that hands-on experience will greatly enhance Sandy's understanding of her position, as well as give her a better understanding of what her salespeople face in their work. As Mrs. Haynes finished speaking, Mark saw her look at her granddaughter and nod slightly. Mr. Reynolds, I'm not proud of the way I acted when we first met, Sandy admitted. My grandmother explained to me how stupid I was and that it shouldn't happen again. If you accept my grandmother's offer, I assure you I will cooperate fully and try to adopt as much of your sales style as possible. Mark understood how hard this apology was for her, even felt some admiration for her. She was willing to take the hit to improve her relationship with her grandmother and, hopefully, better understand how Smith & Haynes had managed to run a successful business for over 50 years. Mrs. Haynes, Miss Phillips, I absolutely must finish work on this car. I must finish it by tomorrow night. The day after tomorrow is the 1st of the month. I'll be in the office, ready to work. I'll give you the month you ask for. Mark saw Mrs. Haynes nod to her niece again, whereupon the young woman gave him a very sweet smile. Mr. Reynolds, my grandmother and I really appreciate your generosity. I assure you, I will be ready to get to work. I look forward to learning as much as I can from you." Mark looked at Sandy Phillips and shifted his gaze to her grandmother. He had a few questions on the tip of his tongue, but decided not to voice them. He knew Mrs. Haynes must have been pretty hard on her granddaughter. Sandy had made a 180-degree turn from her original position. Mark didn't claim to be an expert on women, but he knew that Sandra must be feeling out of sorts after what she perceived as a defeat at his hands. How cooperative she would prove to be remained to be seen. 2 days later, Mark returned to work a few minutes early. His former co-workers gave him a warm welcome in the form of good-natured teasing. "Mark, I don't think I've ever seen you in a suit before. Are you here to lobby for your old job?" Amanda Burns asked. "Something like that," Mark replied. "I was a little hasty when I left. When I started working here, I promised Mrs. Haynes that I would work for 7 years. I was a few months short. We agreed that if I stayed another month, I could leave with her blessing." "So that's why you're so good at sales," Amanda said. "You always keep your promises, and you're a great negotiator. Buyers know they can count on you." Sandra Phillips was just outside the room and heard Amanda's assessment of Mark's qualities, as well as his response. "Mr. Reynolds, thank you for trying to spare my feelings," Sandra said with a slight smile. "Amanda, the truth is that Mrs. Haynes was unhappy with my handling of Mr. Reynolds' sudden departure. He will be my mentor for the next month in hopes that I will better understand the company's products and customers. To that end, I plan to take you with me to meet the customers I work with and make a favorable impression on them," Mark said. "With your education and physical attributes, it shouldn't be difficult." After Amanda left the room, Sandy decided to make sure Mark understood her position. "You just mentioned my physical stats. You have to realize that I will not compromise my values, no matter how significant, for sales." "Good point," Mark agreed. "I strongly recommend that you never meet, contact, or behave inappropriately with customers. It won't end well for you or the company." "I'm glad you feel that way. I was worried that you were going to suggest that I use all the physical indicators, as you called them, that I have in order to make the sale," Sandy admitted. "I'm afraid I still don't quite get it. There's nothing wrong with flashing your best smile, showing your legs and a little cleavage in a professional manner, of course. You're going to have to socialize with men on a regular basis. Believe me when I tell you that in the world of sales, an attractive woman's smile makes a big difference." "And you're suggesting I use sex for sales?" Sandy asked in amazement. "No, on the contrary, I'm telling you not to use sex for sales for any reason ever," Mark insisted. "Sexual attraction is okay, but sex in any form is not. You're an attractive woman with an enviable figure. There's nothing wrong with using that to your advantage." Sandy looked at Mark for a few seconds before replying. "If that's a compliment, you missed the point. I've agreed to learn your sales techniques and apply what I find useful, but I will not show off my legs or breasts for the sake of sales. As a man who clearly lacks the legs and cleavage to seduce other men, how can you even make sales? If I'm dealing with men, I use my knowledge of the product and my ability to gain their respect and often their friendship. If I'm selling to women, I do the same. Plus, I give them my best smile and try to discreetly appeal to their imagination." "Is that why you like to wear polo shirts? Do you want to use your looks and physique to influence a sale in your direction?" Sandy asked. "Make no mistake about it, I never date or get involved with anyone who has anything to do with the company we do business with. But there are a few ladies who may brighten up a bit when I walk in the door. There's nothing unethical about that," Mark replied. "I understand that it can help the sale, but the deciding factor should be the product and the price," Sandy said definitively. "That's why we'll spend the next month visiting customers and studying practical applications. We'll constantly test and refine our sales techniques," Mark promised. "That makes more sense than arguing about it now. Next month will be interesting." Sandy was looking forward to visiting clients and establishing a solid business relationship. In her opinion, Mark is overconfident, but the numbers he generates suggest he has a good reason to be. She admitted to herself that he is good-looking and very masculine, and she could easily imagine women succumbing to his charm. Mark spent the rest of the day setting up appointments. He decided to start with clients located a few minutes away and gradually move on to places where he would have to stay overnight. Sandy arrived at the company parking lot at 6 in the morning and found Mark already in place. She readily agreed with Mark that punctuality was very important. They reached their destination almost an hour early. "There's a nice little diner around the corner," Mark told Sandy. "You need to find out where all the good places to eat or drink coffee are near every business you deal with." Sandy spent most of the drive asking Mark about his methods and what to expect when meeting with customers. "Sandy, I want you to enjoy your coffee and relax. People can sense when you're nervous and think like you're trying to hide something. I chose this business because it is very reasonable and friendly. You know our product and our prices. Just listen to them and answer their questions and concerns as honestly as you can. Remember, we sell ourselves just as much, if not more, than our product. We need to give our customers complete confidence in our honesty and integrity. If you are unsure of an answer, admit it and explain that you will find the correct answer as soon as possible and get back to them. Never try to lie or even exaggerate, and you will do well." "I understand that and completely agree," Sandy replied. "I noticed you didn't say anything about showing off or flirting with the customers." "It's pretty obvious that you shouldn't use that ploy today," Mark replied. "I can see your hands and your face. Everything else is covered. We'll see how it works tonight. All I ask is that for one day next week you wear something a little looser. You have a very nice figure, and it wouldn't hurt you to make that fact obvious." "You seem to have confidence in my figure." "How do you know what my figure is? Did you say that my choice of clothes makes it impossible for men to tell what my figure is?" Sandy asked. "It's impossible to have both. Few men have my powers of observation when it comes to women's shapes," Mark replied with a smirk. "One of the reasons I excel in sales is my ability to look beyond the obvious. I can often identify insecurities and personality flaws by talking to a person for a few minutes. Knowing this can make all the difference in making a sale." "I have to say that's a load of crap," Sandy replied. "You don't have some mysterious ability to know my bra size or my thigh length. By saying I have a great figure, you're using your sales techniques on me. You think flattery will soften and even change my clothing choices, but I can see through your feeble attempts." "Interesting," Mark admitted. "I'm telling the truth and you think I'm joking about your long and very shapely legs. I always try to be honest, but you don't trust me. Now I'm forced to wonder if my clients see the same things you do. Maybe I have a particularly effective device for detecting bullshit and can recognize it better than most people. Your success in sales indicates that most of the time your trick must work," Sandy suggested. Sandy gave in to her grandmother's demands that she bring Mark back and work with him because she had no choice. Grandma is quite firm on this issue. Truth be told, Sandy expected Mark to try to use his looks and natural charm to boost sales. She hadn't realized how knowledgeable he was about their products and contracts, percentages and profit margins. He didn't shy away from using his charm, but remained professional in dealing with customers. Sandy appreciated the wisdom of her grandmother's decision about her traveling with Mark and learning about the world of sales with a master of his craft. Sandy found that she enjoyed meeting with customers and listening to their needs and concerns. She realized why Mark is very good at what he does. He is always polite and professional, remains calm even when some clients lose their temper, even though it was rare. Another thing Sandy has noticed is the obvious interest that many of the female employees show in Mark. They absolutely respond to his smile and easy charm. Not only that, most of the men he interacts with become noticeably friendlier after just a few minutes. The second week, Sandy and Mark took a long road trip, staying in hotels rather than spending a lot of time traveling to distant businesses. Wednesday morning of that week was a pivotal morning for her. "Wow, you look great," Mark said with obvious admiration. "You look great in that look." "Thank you," Sandy replied, blushing. "I thought I'd try out your suggestion about my looks. It's an experiment. Don't expect me to follow your example and flirt like you with women of all ages." "That's a good idea," Mark agreed. "You're much better off using your charms among the male population." Later that afternoon, when Mark and Sandy were having dinner at a chain restaurant, Mark asked the question Sandy had been waiting for with a slight smile. "So, did you notice any difference in the way people reacted to you today? I mean, you were there with me, and you saw some men looking at me and smiling like idiots. In fact, you're doing the same thing now." "I admit it," Mark replied with a grin. "Today, you managed to increase my normal sales by almost 5%. That's a lot compared to the others." "That's due to the fact that I showed a hint of cleavage and a skirt just above my knees." "You'd think they'd never seen women before," Sandra stated. "They don't often see women looking as good as you do," Mark replied. "You've got the right style. Everyone took you seriously. The men couldn't stop smiling at you, but they listened to you at the same time." "You're not saying I look cheap or slutty, are you?" Sandy asked anxiously. "The truth, Sandy, is that you are one of the most stylish women I know. You look and act like a lady. I mean that in a good way. You're not so prim and proper. We both know that some women consider that a sign of class. You're attractive, but considerate. You're interacting more and more with our clients. They're getting more comfortable with you, and you're getting better at explaining our product and the buying process." "It's been a pleasure," Sandy replied with feeling. "I know we didn't start off on the best foot, but I feel like we are doing much better now. You've been very fair to me, considering I drove you to the point of getting fired the first week. I explained my situation to you and your grandmother. I've been building my business since I graduated high school. I have a 7-year plan to work at Smith and Haynes. I was already making plans to leave when we ran into you. I was relieved that I could focus on my next career," Mark explained. "I'm relieved except for the fact that I took you away from the business for a month. I hope it doesn't take a big toll on you. To tell you the truth, I was a little worried about my old clients when I left. Now I'm starting to realize that they'll be fine, maybe even better than when I worked for you," Mark said. Sandy looked forward to her lunches with Mark. He always told interesting stories, listened to her thoughts, and, even when he disagreed, was polite but persuasive enough to defend his opinion. Mark, for his part, realized that he enjoyed spending time with Sandy. She has a wonderful sense of humor while being refreshingly humble. Plus, he found her very attractive. "My sister goes to college in Keensburg," Sandy told Mark at the beginning of the last week of their acquaintance. "She wants to meet me on Friday, which will be the last day of our world tour. We'll be staying at a hotel just 10 miles from her apartment on the last night. I want to go home with her so we can catch up. I hope that's okay with you." "I have a brother and sister, so I understand," Mark replied. "Have a great trip home." The last business they planned to visit was scheduled for late Thursday evening, with a follow-up visit on Friday morning to meet with the owner and convince him to sign the purchase agreement. Having wrapped up work early Friday morning, Mark hoped to make it home in time to drive home in the afternoon. Mark thought the meeting on Thursday afternoon had gone well, except for one very serious problem for him. The 30-year-old son of the company owner had a crush on Sandy. Mark admitted to himself that the guy was good-looking, but past experience with him had changed his mind. He's assertive and challenging. Mark has noticed him humiliating employees more than once while negotiating a sale. During the trip to the hotel, Sandy acted almost giddy. She chatted incessantly, but about almost nothing. Finally, she couldn't keep her secret. "Brett invited me over for dinner tonight, so don't expect me to join you. We'll just have dinner in the hotel restaurant before we head to the bar. There's a small band playing there tonight, so we'll probably dance." "Brett's a nice guy, don't you think?" Sandy asked, although she didn't seem interested in the answer. "Good-looking and well-dressed. We might even get more profit from his company, although that's not why I agreed to his request. He seems like fun." Mark wanted to voice his concerns to Sandy, but he chose to remain silent. She'll start working without him on Friday morning. She's in her mid-20s, has 2 college degrees, and is destined to take control of a prestigious company. What could he possibly tell her that she shouldn't know? Mark liked Sandy a lot, but he didn't think it would be entirely ethical to ask her out, at least not until their working relationship was behind them. Now he wondered if he'd made a mistake or maybe dodged a bullet. If Brett is the man she's looking for, she's not the woman he thinks she is. Mark ordered dinner for the room while working on emails regarding his classic car restoration business. He was proud of the success of his business, started it right out of high school. Now intends to devote all of his time and energy to his business. His time at Smith & Haynes had finally come to an end. Just after 11 o'clock in the evening, Mark decided that was the end of the day and went to bed. He had barely fallen into a sound sleep when a loud knock on the hotel room door snapped him out of his slumber. Mark tried to shake the fog off his brain, got out of bed, and shuffled to the door. As soon as he turned the knob, the door was swung open by Sandy, and she rushed inside, dragging her suitcase behind her. She slammed the door shut and turned to Mark with tears in her eyes. "That asshole thought it was easy to sleep with me. He insisted on walking me to my room after dinner and a few dances. Took my room key to open the door and never gave it back. Started forcefully ripping my clothes off as soon as he closed the door. One of the downsides of a dress with cleavage is it's easy for a damn pervert to grab your breasts." I asked him to get ice for the bottle of alcohol he found in the minibar before we started. He was barely out of sight looking for the ice maker before I grabbed my phone and suitcase and rushed across the lobby. He has my key, so I'll stay the night at your place if that's okay with you. Finally, Sandy seemed to notice Mark standing in front of her in just his underwear. She slowly ran her eyes over his chest and lower body. "I guess you sleep in your underwear. I guess I should be grateful you're wearing so much. I knew you were a tough man, but you're in better shape than I imagined. I have to write to my sister about tomorrow, so don't mind me. Sleep or whatever it was you were doing when I knocked on your door." Mark was fully awake by now, but when he glanced at the clock by his bed, he realized that it was past midnight. He had a long drive ahead of him the next day, and he didn't think there was any gain in confronting Brett. He was probably worked up and a little annoyed that he hadn't gotten sex. "You can stay here, but I'm not giving you the bed," Mark replied. "I told you about dating any of our clients being a bad idea. Brett is an absolute asshole. You should have noticed that before he even managed to grab those big boobs of yours. I'm going back to bed, so whatever you do, please do it quietly." Mark was still pissed at Sandy for getting involved with a jerk like Brett. He was glad she was able to get away from him, but unhappy with her decision to go out with him. Mark realized that he needed to step back and honestly evaluate his feelings before he said too much to Sandy. Surprisingly, he soon fell asleep again. He woke up in the middle of the night to find Sandy sleeping next to him. Her head is resting on his arm and her left leg is thrown over his legs. She is wearing one of his t-shirts that she must have pulled out of her suitcase. Looking at her, Mark realized that she could wear any of his t-shirts at any time. It wasn't long before Mark was awakened again by a loud knock on the door. Swearing under his breath, he promised that if it was that asshole Brett, he would personally kick his ass. Once again, the door swung open as soon as he turned the knob. To his surprise, a pretty young woman entered the room. She quickly looked him over from head to toe and, muttering something to herself, began to look around the room. At that moment, Sandy rolled over onto her back and opened her eyes. "Sarah, why are you here in the middle of the night? Did something happen?" "Sis, did you sleep with that guy? Did he force you to do it? Should I call the police?" The girl, whom Mark now recognized as Sandy's sister, exclaimed demandingly. "Mark? He would never hurt me. He's one of the good guys," Sandy replied. "Why are you here at this hour?" "Sandy, it's almost 8 in the morning. You wrote that we should go out for breakfast before your meeting today, but you didn't mention that you were going to sleep with this guy. Is this the guy you work with? Is it a good idea to have an affair at work?" Sarah asked. "I'm not sleeping with Mark," Sandy insisted. "Well, I guess I did sleep with him, but that's all we did. Just slept next to each other, that's all." "Whatever, but it's hard to believe it when the guy looks so good," Sarah argued. "What happened to that asshole who attacked you last night?" By this time, Mark was fully awake. Once again. The sisters were still chatting in his bedroom. He closed the bathroom door and began to shower. "Sandy, why would you want to go out with a bully when you have a handsome guy like Mark at your disposal?" Sarah asked when they were alone. "I don't know what you're thinking sometimes." "To be honest, neither do I," Sandy replied. I was hoping Mark would tell me to get over Brett and ask me to go out with him. You're right, he's good-looking, but I can't get him to think of me as a desirable woman. I hate my big nose. Maybe I need to get it fixed. You've always said you're proud of the way you look and that any man interested in you would love you just the way you are. Has he said anything about your nose or the way you look? Actually, he always tells me I'm attractive. He just doesn't pretend to believe it. He's great at his job, but he doesn't seem to care much about his personal life, Sandy complained. Sis, when he opened the door, he had a serious look on his face. I can't tell if it's your fault, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is. Maybe he's shy, or maybe he doesn't want to date a woman at work. Is that a bruise? Sarah asked suddenly, looking at her sister's cleavage. Where? Oh, shit! Sandy declared, peering into the t-shirt she was wearing. I told you that asshole was mean to me, but I didn't tell you the damage he did to me. I didn't want you to worry. He came into my room last night, uninvited. He just slipped his hand into my top, grabbed my breasts, and squeezed them hard. He was drunk and saying all sorts of stupid things about how he liked it rough, and that I would learn to like it too. I had to use all my sales techniques to get him to go get ice. Like I said in my message, he still had my room key, so I grabbed my suitcase and phone and rushed here to Mark's room. This guy had hurt me, and I was afraid he wouldn't take no for an answer. Did Brett squeeze your breasts so hard that they were bruised? Mark asked demandingly. Sarah and Sandy were surprised to find Mark standing behind them, wearing only a towel wrapped around his chest. The expression on his face was one that Sandy had never seen on him before. He was beyond furious. Seeing how upset he was, Sandy immediately responded, Yes, he left marks on my left breast. I didn't encourage him or give him any permission to touch me, Mark. He just put his hand on top of mine and squeezed it really hard. Mark seemed to consider her words before making the request. I don't want to embarrass you, Sandy, but can I see the bruises? If Sandy was surprised at the request, her sister was simply stunned as Sandy nodded and pulled the top of her t-shirt down enough to expose her left breast. It never occurred to Sandy to refuse Mark. She watched the intensity of his emotions playing across his face. It was obvious that he was very upset. She couldn't help but feel excitement mixed with worry as he studied her breasts so intently. She wondered if he was really going to touch her when he ran his hand a few centimeters away from the bruises and nodded to himself, imagining exactly how Brett was squeezing her. Sarah, please take some pictures of those bruises on Sandy's phone, Mark asked, finally taking his eyes off Sandy's torso. I don't know how this is going to work out, but we may need them. Be sure to take some clear pictures. It's obvious the bruises were done by a big hand. He's going to be damn sorry he did that to your sister. I guarantee it. Mark was still upset as he opened his suitcase and pulled out clean boxers. Dropping the towel and dressing in his briefs, he muttered something to himself. Sarah's sigh brought his attention back to his surroundings. I'd forgotten where I was for a minute. Or rather, I knew where I was, but I'd forgotten that there were ladies present, Mark said. I'm thinking about that low-life asshole and how a father allows his son to take liberties at work. Thinking back on some of the things I've seen and heard over the years, I realize I should have done something. At the very least, I should have ended our business partnership. Sandy, you're not going to work today. Have a good breakfast with your sister and drive home safely. I'll take care of business here. Just relax and enjoy your time with Sarah. What are you gonna do? If we're not careful, we'll lose their business completely. They buy a lot of our products, Sandy said nervously. Sandy, they should be worried about losing our business. Smith and Haynes shouldn't deal with scumbags like that. I will fire them as our client. I'll call your grandmother and explain it to her. I'm sure she'll approve. We won't do business with any company that treats people the way Brett treated you. You're probably right, Sandy admitted. Be careful if you see Brett. He's pretty big and bragged about what a tough soccer player he was in high school. I'm sure he is, Mark replied with a wry grin. If you don't have feelings for him, I plan to give him some fresh bruises on his face. I'll see how he likes it. I don't care about him, Mark. I just don't want you to get hurt or in trouble because I was stupid enough to spend some time with that idiot, Sandy stated. Sarah, be sure to take pictures of the bruises. After that, take your sister to breakfast. I'll handle everything here. Today is the last day of the month you promised my grandmother. I've learned a lot traveling with you, Mark, Sandy said as she walked over to Mark and hugged him. "If you ever want to come back to Smith and Haynes, there will be a job for you, I guarantee it. Good luck with your growing business." "Sis, you could have waited until he was dressed again before you hugged him. It was a pretty good game, though, when you think about it," Sarah said with a smirk as she looked over Mark's naked torso. By the middle of the next month, Sandy had established herself as a competent sales manager and was becoming more and more confident as a marketer. She hadn't spoken to Mark since the day he told her to go home with Sarah. That fact disappointed Sandy. She thought they were getting along quite well. She had even hoped that Mark would take a romantic interest in her, especially after the story her grandmother told her the following Monday. "Sandy, I had a long talk with Mark about your month under his supervision. The first thing he mentioned was how and why he severed our relationship with Gaston and Son. He told me about young Gaston's highly inappropriate behavior and how it was the last straw for Mark. He explicitly told Ben Gaston that his son Brett was a worthless lowlife and that we would no longer do business with people in his circle. Mark said he was going to do it. I thought you would understand his decision," Sandy replied. "Is that going to be a problem now?" "As far as I'm concerned, no. Ben Gaston called me in a rage the same day Mark ended our business relationship with them." "You mean they wanted our product that badly?" Sandy asked in surprise. "I don't think so. He wanted me to fire Mark. Mark seems to have said something unpleasant to Brett and also to Ben. Mark was almost to his car when Brett caught up with him in the company parking lot." "The police have the surveillance video." Brett punched Mark in the face. "Oh no, I warned Mark that Brett is a big guy and pretty tough." "Was he hurt?" Sandy asked. "Yes, spent the night in the hospital, but he is expected to make a full recovery." After the police asked a few questions and reviewed the surveillance video, Mark was not charged. "It was clearly self-defense," Sandy's grandmother slyly replied as Sandy cried out in surprise. "Grandma, are you telling me that—" "Mark kicked his ass," Mrs. Haynes replied with a wide grin. "You made a very good impression on Mark. He admitted that he wasn't disappointed when Brett attacked him. He was very angry that the idiot had treated you that way. Is there anything going on between you and Mark by any chance?" "I haven't spoken to him since Friday, but to be honest, I wouldn't mind getting to know him better," Sandy told her grandmother. "He doesn't work for us anymore, so that shouldn't be a problem, should it?" "Honey, if he's right for you, don't worry about nothing. You're right, as long as he doesn't work for us, it's fine. Honestly, I would never pass up the opportunity to date a man like Mark for any other reason than our feelings for each other." Sandy thought about contacting Mark, but couldn't think of a single good reason to do so. If he was even remotely interested, he would have called her or stopped by work. 3 weeks later, Sandy and her family attended the wedding of one of her cousins. Sandy's grandmother is one of 4 sisters. 3 of her sisters have several children each, and now the sisters' granddaughters were becoming adults and finding spouses. Sandy has 12 cousins, and all of them were attractive. Sandy spent a lot of time with them as they grew up. They got along with each other like sisters. As the girls moved on to high school and college, Sandy began to feel left out of their conversations, which mostly centered on boys. Sandy considered herself the least attractive cousin. While others told stories of dating and romance, Sandy contributed very little. Her cousins noticed this. In school, Sandy was focused on her studies and did very well academically, but never had anything resembling a serious relationship. Sarah insisted that Sandy's lack of suitors was due to her strong and unyielding character, convinced Sandy to be less demanding and critical. Guys just don't like girls who are bossy and pushy. Although Sandy recognized that Sarah was right, she was unwilling to put up with mediocrity in herself and others. This attitude goes a long way toward explaining why she so often stayed home on weekends while her friends and cousins went out on dates. Now another cousin is getting married. Sandy has been to enough weddings like this to know how it's going to be. First, all the girls will introduce their groomsmen. Eventually, Sandy will be asked if she has anyone, even though all her cousins know about her dismal dating history. Sandy will be the center of several awkward minutes as the girls list the names of possible suitors and reasons why they might be a good fit for her. Eventually, the conversation would turn to less painful topics. At the reception, Sandy felt like she was experiencing déjà vu all over again. Her cousin Angela had just married a handsome, athletically built guy. and all the cousins agreed that she had managed to find a good husband. "Sandy, did you come with your significant other today?" Marie asked, loud enough for the other women to pay attention. "Well, with my new position at Smith and Haynes, I haven't had time for that. Grandma is counting on me learning the business well enough to replace her." "You don't have time to date? Have you met any interesting men since Brianna's wedding last spring?" Marie pushed. "Not really," Sandy began, but Sarah interrupted her. "I'd say Mark is a very interesting man. Sis doesn't talk about it often, but she spent a month in sales training with a real handsome man. Sandy loves Sis for trying to improve her standing in the community, but she's worried about the inevitable questions she'll be asked. Besides the jokes," Cousin Charity joins in, "the affair at work? Is it still going on, and what does this guy look like?" "Well, Sandy managed to say before Sarah revealed the shocking information. "Walking through the door right now," murmured Sarah, looking at the entrance. Mark was smiling and shaking hands with the groom who was standing at the entrance greeting the guests. It was obvious that the two men were good friends, judging by the way they were patting each other on the back and laughing. "Oh, wow!" Marie exclaimed. "He's very handsome, Sandy. You're going to introduce us to your boyfriend, aren't you?" Sandy stared at Sarah, trying to find a reasonable answer to Marie's question. Why did Sarah make it sound like she and Mark were dating? Now she found herself in a most awkward situation. Sarah saw Sandy grimace and decided to try to make the best of the situation. "I don't think Mark has seen Sandy yet. I'll go get him and bring him over so everyone can meet him. He's a great guy." Sarah saw Sandy's face turn crimson at her words. Sarah had only known Mark briefly, but was sure he would be a gentleman and help Sandy out of the situation Sarah had created. Mark was chatting with his friend Lance when he recognized Sarah walking up to him. His smile grew even brighter as he hugged her. "Sarah, I didn't realize you were here today. Are you friends with Angela? Is Sandy here too?" "Yes, Sandy's here and she needs your help. I kind of told all our cousins that she was working with a real hottie when they asked if she was seeing anyone. I gave the impression that you liked each other and all the girls want to meet you. Sandy is scared to death of being made out to be a desperate woman, and it will be my fault," Sarah quickly explained as she led Mark to her gathered cousins. "Could you please be really nice to her? It would mean a lot to Sandy and keep me out of her disfavor." Mark was digesting everything Sarah was telling him as he led her across the room. "I love being asked for favors. Don't worry, I'll get it all done." Sandy froze in place as she watched Sarah and Mark approach her. She didn't know what to say, how to act, or how to get out of the situation. Mark glowered as he moved over to Sandy, put his arm around her shoulders, pulled her to him, and spoke loudly. "It's so good to see you again, Sandy." Pulling her against his chest, he whispered in her ear, "Can I kiss you? Would you mind?" When he released her from his embrace, Sandy looked questioningly into his eyes. Seeing what she was looking for, she nestled her lips against Mark's. He needed no further encouragement as he pulled Sandy to his chest again. Sandy lost track of time as she was completely ruled by her emotions. She was relieved that Mark had asked to kiss her, that she was in his arms, and that he didn't care who saw them. She didn't want this moment to end. "Sis, you've caused a bit of a scandal here," Sarah said quietly, but loud enough for the others to hear, to her sister. "All those sluts are getting wet just looking at you." "Oh, Grandma will be here in a minute. You better let the kid go and find out what she wants." Sandy's face flushed and glowed as she stepped away from Mark to greet her grandmother. As she regained control of her emotions, she wondered if there would be a problem. To her surprise, Grandma Haynes moved over to Mark and reached up to kiss him on the cheek. She took his hand in hers, turning to Sandy with a bright smile. "Your mom and dad wondered who the young man was who hugged you and greeted you so warmly," Mrs. Haynes said. "I assured them he was a fine man and offered to introduce them to him. Your mother is dying of curiosity. Let's go in and see her and settle the matter."